We're still working out this unusual incident over in the 20th chapter of Genesis. Abraham is at it again. He's told everyone that Sarah is his sister, but he fails to mention that she's also his wife. Yeah, that again. And it goes about as well as it did last time down in the land of Egypt. The current king of Gerar, thinking she's a single lady, takes Sarah with him with the intentions of making her his wife. God has to step in and put a stop to it. In a dream, he appears to that king, his name is Abimelech, and tells him about what he's messing with. He doesn't realize he has another man's wife. God has to tell him that, and tells the man, instructs that king, he needs to straighten this out. Now we'll start at verse 9. I'm going to read out of the King James. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said unto him, What hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. Verse 10, And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? And Abraham said, Because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. Abraham, what were you thinking? Well, I just figured you're a bunch of heathens, and you wouldn't hesitate to commit murder to get to my wife. Abraham just assumed, or perhaps he had heard, that this place was quite lawless and quite dangerous. Well, then what are you doing going down there? If this was such a bad place, why not go somewhere else? Well, given what God had done down in the valley, my guess is his pickings were slim, as they said. If you wanted to locate, if he needed to locate, this was his only opportunity. Verse 11, And Abraham said, Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of She's the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. I mean, I didn't lie. She is my sister, but we have different mothers. So technically, I only told you a half lie. Again, this is the kind of Abraham I can relate to, someone who's going to say anything, no matter how ridiculous, out of embarrassment, fear, and humiliation. I'm nothing like the Abraham that has faith, but I am like this guy. And then Abraham continues and admits to an even more shocking fact. Verse 13, And it came to pass when God caused me, this is Abraham speaking, to wander from my father's house, that I said unto her, unto Sarah, This is thy kindness which thou shalt show unto me. At every place whither we shall come, say of me, He is my brother. So this kind of explains why this has come up a couple of times. The two of them concocted this scheme almost 2 decades before. This was going to be their plan all along. It was an arrangement he and Sarah had, going all the way back to the very infancy of their relationship with God. So in my mind, I'm a little conflicted as to how I feel about this. I know that it's tempting to conclude from this that Abraham didn't trust God to protect him. Yeah, we could look at it that way, but isn't it just possible we should take a wider view of this before we condemn him? I know this is me talking. I can be very critical of this man, but I'm not so sure I've been very fair up to this point. In this case, shouldn't we consider the fact that This strategy, this scheme that they came up with, was devised at a time when Abraham, then Abram, had just met God. Abram was raised in a pagan God-worshiping family, and though not told specifically, this may be why God told Abram to leave his homeland and his family behind. Maybe God wanted the man whom he was going to use to establish the chosen people to distance himself as far as possible from his idol-worshiping relatives. It's quite possible that Abram knew very little about that God that called him to move out of Ur of the Chaldees. There was going to be a definite learning curve, and in the beginning, Abram may not have had the foundation of faith in God that would become the hallmark of his later life. So that's one possible mitigating factor here in our assessment of the arrangement between Abram and Sarai made in those early days. They just weren't sure if they could trust this Jehovah who was calling them to pack up and move on to bigger and better things. They're about to set out on a big adventure, and in those days, travel was always dangerous, and they didn't really know the one who'd be leading them. So they took a few precautions to include coming up with this deception. The other thing we should consider is the fact that there's no reason to believe that just because we take steps to protect ourselves that we're displaying some sort of sense of distrust in God's providence. In this case, I don't see a problem with Abraham coming up with some sort of security plan, not this one, but a security plan that, relies on intelligence and action. It wasn't a betrayal of faith for Abraham to find a way to keep himself safe. That was not the problem here. The lies, the dangerous and thoughtless handling of his marriage, that was the real problem. What's your point, John? Nowhere, listen to me, does God equate faith with inaction. When God says, trust me, he doesn't mean sit there and do so in a passive manner. God's never worked that way. He's always given us responsibilities in this relationship with him. Trusting God involves believing that he gives us the skills, he prepares us, he puts us in the right position, and then provides us with discernment to work with him in this world to achieve what he's intended us to achieve. And that includes making decisions that will help guard ourselves, preserve ourselves in order to protect and fulfill our stewardship. If you get up tonight and lock your front door, that doesn't mean you don't trust God to protect you. It means you're smart. You know what kind of world you live in, and God gave you the discernment to do such things. There's a fine line between total self-reliance and executing our marching orders. Sometimes it's difficult to know when to act and when to wait. But that's what an active prayer and study life will help us with. If we are maintaining a constant connection between our spirits and his spirits, then we'll make better and more informed decisions. This is sort of why I want to give Abraham a little slack here. He and God were just getting to know each other in those early days when he and Sarai hatched this scheme. He wasn't, fully aware of how much God wanted from him, and likewise didn't really know how powerful God was or how willing God was to protect him. He just didn't know a lot back then, and so he covered his bases. Now, don't forget, since there's no real evidence for what I'm saying to you, this theory of mine, you must treat it like nothing more than a guess. My guess is that this is not necessarily Abraham being faithless. He is just protecting himself. They came up with this scheme decades ago, and they just fell into a bad habit and didn't realize they needed to adjust. This is a guess, but it's still something I want you to do. I want you to get into these stories to pull out of them what you think of them. Of course, there's the truth and there's what we think of them, but if what you think of them and the truth are in conflict, forget it. But always go through this so that it becomes real to you. All right, verse 10. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, what sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? And Abraham said, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet indeed she's my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. Verse 13, and it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house that I said unto her, this is my kindness. This is thy kindness, which thou shalt show unto me. At every place whither we shall come, say of me, he is my brother. Verse 14, and Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants and gave them unto Abraham and restored him Sarah, his wife. Now, I'm sure most of you are thinking I'm way off here about Abimelech's motivations. And you may be right. Maybe my interpretation of Abimelech's actions as fear and greed motivated are unfounded. Okay, then tell me why, after being treated the way he was treated by Abraham, after that truthful but weak excuse, why, oh, why would Abimelech follow up his mild rebuke with the delivery of this largesse? Okay, yes, as I said, Abraham was honest. He admitted his mistake. But don't you think Abimelech had more than enough incentive to be cold, angry, and downright ugly to this desert prince? Of course he did. But he wasn't going to cut off his nose despite his face. He saw opportunity and decided to do whatever he could to smooth things over. If you disagree with me, then why didn't this Philistine king kick him out just like the Egyptian Pharaoh did 20 years ago? Well, you may say he was hoping to get Abraham to give his God a good report. You say all Abimelech was looking for was for Abraham to pray for the king and the kingdom. He was trying to motivate a good prayer response. All right, I see your point. But that's a pretty high cost to pay for a positive prayer, don't you think? This gesture, this giving of the oxen and the servants, that feels more like a peace offering than anything else. But here, by the way, is what I think seals my theory. Verse 15, and Abimelech said, behold, my land is before thee. Dwell where it pleaseth thee. Who here remembers when Amazon was searching the country for potential locations for an additional administrative headquarters? Remember that? This was a few years ago. Man, the towns were rolling out the red carpet. Sweetheart tax deals, promises for lax zoning laws, incentives and enticements galore. Cities across the country wanted Amazon as close as possible because they knew wherever Amazon was, so was the money. Too much was not enough as far as civic leaders were concerned. They wanted to be associated with the mighty online retailer no matter what, because they knew there were profits involved. Abraham, let's let bygones be bygones. There's no need to leave. I'm not mad at you. You and your sheep, you're welcome. In fact, you can have any part of my kingdom you want. Only please just stay. Wait, where does it say that? It doesn't. But you explain to me why after all that foolishness, after all that potential wrath baiting, did Abimelech tell Abraham, you can stay anywhere you like? Well, he just wanted that prophet Abraham to give a good report to his boss. All right, maybe. But are you telling me that this wasn't going to help the king fill his coffers too? Verse 16, and Sarah said, and he said unto Sarah, he said, behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all other, thus she was reproved. Now, I have to tell you, and this isn't news to you, but studying the Bible can very often be rather difficult. There are things in this book that are not easy to figure out. I've honestly wondered about that. Why does God make his words so hard to understand at times? I mean, he wants us to get it right, doesn't he? Then why doesn't he make his book plain and simple? And it's not like we could sit down with him and ask for clarification on things. I have really wondered about this more than a few times. And when I've been lucid enough to remember to take the time to pray for better understanding, the answer is inevitably the same every time. God never wants us to rely exclusively on anything except him. Not our own strength, not our own moral fiber, and especially not our own intellect. And sometimes God will purposely share with us something we cannot make sense out of just to remind us to look to him. I believe that's what we have here. The language of this verse is so elusive that it seems we'll never really know what it means, perhaps even till we get to heaven and ask God directly, or however we learn things there. It's not that it's unintelligible. It's just that it could actually mean a few things. Which one is the correct interpretation is our biggest challenge. And unto Sarah he said, behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all other. Thus she was reproved. Very difficult language. Well, first of all, I kind of like the sarcasm coming from Abimelech. He tells Sarah he's done something for her brother. He doesn't say Abraham is her husband, but rather, I think, acerbically says something that reminds us all of the lie these two told. Ouch! That kind of hurts, but it's funny too. And by the way, don't go around saying that Sarah's the victim here. She was complicit in this little deception. You can argue whether or not she should have or could have come clean, but the fact remains she didn't. I gave your brother 1,000, it says, by the way, pieces of silver in the King James, but the word pieces is in italics, which everyone knows, all of you know, all you chapel regulars know. When you see a word in italics in the King James, it means it was added by the translator. The literal is 1,000 silver. Now, this is where the scholarly disagreements begin, and there are a lot of them in this verse. Most agree that the word shekel was probably meant to be the word used here. However, it's not found in the original. Either it wasn't the word Moses was thinking of when he wrote it, or it was one of those, it was the word, it was one of those situations where the word is so obvious that it would be redundant to put it in there. That's not all that foreign to us in our time, is it? If you walked up to the clerk at Foot Locker and asked how much these new Air Jordans are, and she says $125, you wouldn't ask, dollars? Do you mean $125? Of course you wouldn't. Of course she means dollars. What else would it be? Maybe to use the word shekel in that place. Shekel is their form of money. Maybe if Moses put that word shekel there in that time, it would have been unnecessary. So Moses decided not to include it. He wrote 1,000 silver because he didn't think he needed anything other than that. Those that would read it would know he meant 1,000 silver shekels. That's one theory. So Abimelech tells Sarah he gave Abraham, her brother, sarcastic wink, 1,000 whatever of money of silver. Silver was their money. Now, this isn't coins or anything. They didn't have coins. This was 1,000 silver, 1,000 probably weight of silver. Now, the interesting thing is he gave Abraham a lot of things. We read that a few verses ago, sheep and oxen and servants, etc. He even gave him whatever land he wanted. But he only tells Sarah about the 1,000 silver. Why? Well, here is where some more confusion comes in. John, why are we doing this? Why do we spend so much time on these things? So many little tiny pieces of scripture you're making us dig out like we're trying to dig a hole. I want this to matter to you. I want you to see that this is important. There's so much we can learn from these things or not. We may dig through this and never find the answers, but at least God can see that it actually matters to you. What he says is important to you. You're taking the time to find out exactly what he has to say, even if that becomes fruitless. I want you to get into the habit of wanting to know. We're working slowly through this controversial verse because I want you to think deeply about God's word. I want you to want to figure this stuff out. And by working through these things in front of you, I'm hoping you're getting to see that although it can be difficult, we actually start to establish a strong relationship with what God is trying to tell us. You've heard this all before. Verse 16 again. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. I'm reading it right out of the King James. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all other. Thus she was reproved. The controversy, another controversy, the next controversy, I should say, hinges on this little word he. Who is he? Now, to some, the answer is obvious, which means the full meaning of Abimelech's statement is obvious. But is it? In literature, to determine who a personal pronoun refers to, one need only look at the subject. You know that. What is the noun this pronoun is speaking of? Well, that's our problem here. There are actually two nouns spoken of. Technically, one is a proper noun and one is a noun, but they are both basically nouns. One is Abraham and one is the money, here referred to as 1,000 silver. Which one is a covering of the eyes, which is yet another but related controversy? What does Abimelech mean by a covering of the eyes? Is this a literal covering for the eyes, or is it something else? Starting to see why this is such a hotly debated verse? And actually, whichever of the two, money or Abraham, you believe is the he referred to will determine what's meant by the covering of the eyes. So please stay with me as we try to work this out. This is very complicated and confusing, but we're going to see what we can discover. So let's answer the covering of the eyes controversy, and that should help us to determine the meaning, or as close as we can, to this difficult to unravel verse. Now, some say that Abimelech means, what he means here is simply a veil. Now, let me just quickly cover one possible interpretation because it's a little funny and a lot ridiculous. I'm not sure who made the suggestion, but my man H.C. Leupold references in his commentary the theory, which he strenuously objects to, of course. You'll see why in a minute. He simply brings this theory up to demonstrate how outrageous these things can become. Apparently, there is a suggestion that Abimelech gave the veil to shield Abraham from Sarah's face, which will surely be constantly flashing angry looks at him for the rest of his life. Someone has suggested the veil would be worn by Abraham to protect him from Sarah. Ridiculous, but pretty funny. Now, I'm not sure if that theory was proffered for serious consideration or was simply as a joke. It got a laugh out of me. So back to serious consideration of the facts. Though not for the above reason, there are still those who believe that the 1,000 silver was to be used to procure a veil in order to hide Sarah's beauty from everyone. I mean, after all, some will have you believe that it's Sarah's beauty that gets her in trouble. Abimelech, in a charmingly sweet way, says for Sarah to use the 1,000 silver to buy an appropriate face covering so she doesn't have to deal with more men like himself who want to steal her to be their wives. Well, I'm all for keeping our interpretations simple. This is certainly a simple interpretation, but I say it's a little too simple and naive, actually. First of all, that would be one heck of an expensive veil. Secondly, I think we talked ourselves into rejecting the whole beauty of Sarah theory on this one. She was 90 years old, and please forgive me, probably no longer kidnappingly beautiful. No doubt a lovely 90-year-old woman, perhaps even the most beautiful 90-year-old woman in the world, but I'm just not thinking she needed her face covered to protect her from male suitors, and I'm fairly certain Abimelech didn't either. This king doesn't strike me as an impractical guy, and I would think a veil that sets you back 1,000 silver for a 90-year-old woman wouldn't be the most prudent use of the resources of the kingdom. No doubt a few of you are glaring at me at the moment, so let's move on. So Abimelech was not probably referring to a physical or actual or literal face covering when he suggested we still don't know who he is yet, he is to thee a face covering. This isn't probably referring to a veil or anything else that physically covers the face, because why? That would be my first question. Why would you spend $1,000 on a veil that wouldn't be useful? We're pretty sure this is metaphorical. So what are the other possibilities? Well, if the he is the money, then it has been suggested that Abimelech's gift of money was meant as a sort of restitution for what the king had done. The 1,000 silver was meant as an I'm sorry gift. I hope this can make up for the fact that I almost made you a bigamist, but I never meant to. The reference to covering of the eyes is merely a poetic way of meaning, an appeasement. I'm offering this money to hopefully help you to forget that I've wronged you. In other words, maybe this gift will blind you to the offense I may have caused you. Now, this one actually has some biblical support. Over in the 32nd chapter of this same book of Genesis, we read of Jacob's instructions to his servants on how to appease or placate his brother Esau. Now, we're going to leave a lot of details out. We will get there soon enough. It is a major story in Genesis, but for now, forgive me for just reading the verse and explaining it briefly for our current purposes. Genesis 32:20. And say ye moreover, behold, thy servant Jacob is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goeth before me, and afterward I will see his face. Peradventure he will accept of me. The original Hebrew that gets translated into our phrase, I will appease him, can actually literally be translated, I will cover his face. It's a Hebrew idiom that's used when offering compensation for causing someone harm. So this is actually not such a far out possibility with what's going on back here in the 20th chapter. Abimelech, the theory goes, wants to cover Sarah's face. I know it says eyes here, but aren't your eyes on your face? The king wants to cover her eyes with the 1,000 silver as an appeasement. He's trying to make up for this negative experience with a generous gift. The 1,000 silver offering was meant to communicate his regret as well as his high esteem for the dignified couple. It's not a bad theory, but I think one thing holds it back. My biggest problem with actually these theories that suggest this, the ones we've presented so far, is that they actually presume a sense of guilt on Abimelech's part. The impetus of the king of Gerar's actions, according to these theories, is some feeling of being, personally responsible for the near disaster that God himself had to mediate. Well, this is why I don't accept any of them. You see, I don't think Abimelech feels guilty at all. In fact, he's carrying himself much more like a victim rather than the aggressor. I don't think he's sorry for anything because he knows he's the one who's been duped. Plus, God actually prevented him from making this a disaster. In other words, God stopped this whole thing before it became a train wreck. And so what is there to feel guilty for? Well, Johnny, he took the guy's wife. Well, that wasn't his fault. That's the point of this whole section. Abimelech was just an innocent bystander who was almost ruined by a couple of cowardly Chaldeans. Okay, those are the theories I disagree with. Come back next time and we'll see if we can wrap this up by getting to the bottom of whatever is going on here. See you then.